a Native American. And, we have to grow up. Those guys have to grow up too.
Amen to that.
Yeah,
You're preaching to my choir.
Yeah, I mean, it's a, I understand his perspective, but what I realize is that his perspective is coming from a sense of entitlement and, a different kind of entitlement, but it's not individuated, is what it is not.
Okay.
And the play that we're doing is about reconciliation, and that's reconciliation between two people who are extremely estranged. And we have that in the Native American community, obviously, but to suggest that however many Native Americans were in North America when Columbus arrived in 1500, let's say, they don't have an entitlement to two continents, right? And
well, the world's always moving, and so I get their point, but the entitlement piece, even going back to the play, it's played from the scale of the personal, but metaphorically it transcends that into all scales of community, neighbors, states, countries, the world, in terms of that kind of intense, bitter conflict that needs reconciliation.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm just cooking along, trying to digest it all.
Right.
And
I think you said it though, with people need to grow up, because what I see too, even with a lot of the red stuff, red state stuff, and some blue as well. It's just when it gets into this infighting and, Hatfield McCoy crossing over the line, lobbing these political Molotov cocktails, it's all based in unresolved trauma, and children who have not owned their stuff as adults. The child has not become the parent of the man or the woman or any gender in between, and then that just always causes discord.
Mm-hmm.
Psychologically and culturally.
And so here okay, so let's go back and talk about the issue that you raised with Ezra Pound, because I'm going to concur with you very emphatically.
Yeah, so the point I had raised previously was that Skip most likely, and we pretty much know for sure, knows more Chinese than Ezra Pound did. This isn't to disparage Pound. It's only to call out into Exhibit A, fact structure of what actually occurred. And that's not a disparaging quality. That's important, even if it's uncomfortable for some people.
Truly.
And that point being that Ezra Pound was not fluent in Chinese, that he used what's called a trot or a trotter. And it's someone who trots out the language character by character, translating word for word. And then he plays a stew game with his exquisite poetic skills and creates beautiful poetry. But the drawback there is that the original Chinese essence is inherently almost undeniably lost. And so there's a piece culturally of the original work that does not shine through to share culture to culture. It, in a sense, westernizes the Chinese analects and the classics.
Well, I think he probably got the essence of some of this stuff because you can't even look at a Chinese word without getting some of that.
Right, with a picture.
Right. And so what he was doing, he was taking Chinese, and he was using the Wei Jiao's dictionary, which is 100,000, approximately 100,000 characters. And and so he was taking the Chinese character by character and getting the essence of the meaning of the characters. And most of those characters have many, many meanings in them, many meanings, and embedded within them, because one character is embedded within another, and so forth. So, so then he was applying his poetic synthesis, his poetic genius to the ideas which emerge from that. And that's not wrong in a sense, because, well, first of all, we don't really know exactly what Confucius was saying, right? And I think we may know a little bit more about the I Ching, but documents like the I Ching were developed over several thousand years. And so what what you're looking at is kind of a movie, okay? And when I was studying Chinese professionally as a Marine officer, I realized that it was opening up another part of my brain. I mean, I didn't realize it in those terms, but I realized that I was seeing pictures rather than hearing sounds, right?
And that happens every time you learn a language. I mean, even a couple who one is fluent, say, in French to the point that they dream in French, and the other can hold their own in conversation in French, there are concepts that they just can't convey, the subtle nuances that are embedded in the language, and even in the sound psychology, even in the visual psychology. And so, yeah, that's a great point there, because you basically, to use the term, trot out two different lines of translation bents. I mean, and his is akin to the narrative biography, whereas then pure translators are looking to step back, basically to not have their name on the book translated by, but it's still the author or the original, and get exactly the nuance and subtlety from the language. And that's almost, it's not impossible, but that's the integrity way of translating. The other way is more the narrative biography way, where you're getting at the essence, but you're not spending that last 5%, the other 95% to purely translate.
Yeah, I haven't run into any Chinese men or women who've looked at his Chinese translations and said, yeah, this is what it says. But I mean, it's something like this. We all know about the hero's journey, okay? The hero is an orphan, he's an outsider, and he gathers a group of people around him to help him get something accomplished. He sees something needs to be done. He wants to get something accomplished. He meets a girl, right? He meets a girl. To Luke Skywalker's eternal consternation, the girl he met happened to be his sister, but it's a little awkward when that happens. So he meets a girl, and then he takes his band of other outsiders, and they go off and they have some adventure. And more and more people who are outsiders are gathered to him. It's something like this YouTube channel, right?
That's a good point.
Right. So more and more outsiders are drawn to what he's saying because it's different from what the power devils are saying, and then there's some sort of conflict, and then there's a denouement. So if you didn't know Star Wars, for example, and this is probably true of almost all movies, but if you didn't know Star Wars, you could turn it on without any sound and just look at the pictures, just look at the movie going by, and you would pretty much know what's going on. Right. And that's what Chinese is. Now, the problem you get into, I'm going to pull up my character that I often talk about.
Oh, I remember this one, I think.
Yeah.
Or was I think Tim and I went the other way and played the directional
Right.
game. Yeah.
Right. Okay. But I mean that's a fundamental thing, and
Right.
now I'm not finding it readily, so it's not a good sign. I have over 1 million files on this
Oh, I get it.
computer, so all right. Let's see if I get it by this trick. Okay, one more trick I have up my sleeve.
While you're doing that, I'm gonna mute and grab another cup of coffee.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's get a new tab. Detecting language. Right. It's Japanese this time. All right. There it is. Oh, got to do it a different way. This may not be. I had it, and then what did I do? Okay, there it is. Okay, let me grab that and put it onto the link here. Get it blown up so everybody can see it. I can see it, but it's going to be way too tiny for everybody. Sorry to be doing this, but it's necessary. Okay, so yeah.
Yeah, if I remember this image, this is a really important one.
Yeah, it surely is. And all right. All right, so now I'm going to share this. Going to share this Japanese character, and this is a riddle for those of you who don't know the secret. The riddle is this is the Japanese character for man. It literally translates from Japanese as otoko, and it's also a Chinese character. And in this Chinese character for man, there are actually two characters. The top character is a rice field. And so you can imagine yourself looking down at a rice field that's divided up in a farm, and you're looking down at it. So that's a rice field. And the character on the bottom is strength. And so literally this character means strength in a rice field. And so that's the character for man, strength in a rice field. That's what it means in literal translation. But once you know it's strength in a rice field, then you always see it as man. I mean, I've been studying this stuff for more than 40 years, so more than 50 years at least. So for me, if I look at this character, to me it means man, and I see it in different ways. But the point of the story is that there was a study done between Westerners and Japanese, and the question that was asked was, this is the Japanese character for man, and which direction is this man going? Is he going to the right, or is he going to the left? And 90% of all Westerners say he's going to the right, while 90% of all Japanese say he's going to the left. Now, why is that? Well, because we Westerners are always leaning into things. We're always forging ahead. We're not being, we're often not very careful about getting into things. And so we jump into them. Whereas for Japanese, they see this as strength, and they see it as a martial art. So this martial artist has his foot out this way, and he's leaning back on his other foot, and he's ready to kick. And that's a symbol of strength. And so that's strength in a rice field. And 90% of all Westerners say he's going to the right, and 90% of all Japanese say he's going to the left. I think that's probably true of Chinese too. So the issue is that fundamentally, Western men and women and Eastern men and women see things fundamentally differently. I mean, to see that image and think, okay, the kinetic aspect of it is going this way versus going this way.
Well, even the martial arts kata of leaning back and the hand forward prior to the kick. There's the feint in there, and there's the settled on your back foot so that the front foot and hands can just fly. I mean, so if someone comes in, you just let them come in because you intercept, and you're not staunch on, both feet like more of a U.S. piece and put your back into it. You're sitting on your back heel, maybe even on your back toes. And it allows for pivot and redirect. And anything in the front is like just a cheese grating fan. I mean, nothing's coming through.
And so one other way to look at that, I actually look at it as a man with feet and arms and a head. And so that then you get the image of intelligence, let's say, and the idea of intelligence there. And
that's a really good point, Skip, because I just noticed too, the rice field is the 4 psychological functions also. Then
so our minds are fertile with ideas and all those kinds of ideas, right? And so it's the difference between eros and logos. You can learn from your mother or father what this means, but then you can do an amplification of that in the eros and say, oh, well, I see such and such in it, and I see such and such in it. And so it's no longer just this character. And so my mind, when I look at that character, I'm seeing my whole history in Japan. I'm seeing the conversation I had with someone about the distinction between the directionality of the different people, and I'm seeing the implications of that. And so there are so many different associations I have with that. And so it's something like when you're reading a novel, once you get into it, if you get into a novel that you really like, you're no longer seeing the words. You're seeing the moving images of the story. And when a movie maker tries to then make a movie of that novel, very often they fail. And they fail because, or they're a disappointment. So-and-so reads a novel, and there's, okay, what comes to mind is Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novel, Love in the Time of Cholera. Okay.
Right.
And that novel, you cannot possibly grok what that novel means until you read every word of it, every word, because the last word in the novel, the very last word in the novel, is forever. And you cannot possibly appreciate how important that word is. Even if you're reading the last page, you flip to the last page and you're reading the last page and you see this word forever, you cannot grok it. And it's only by reading the entire book that you appreciate why Garcia Marquez won the Nobel Prize for Literature.
You pick out a perfect author example, because Gabriel Garcia Marquez, even in, for example, 100 Years of Solitude, he can describe a bowel movement, and it's a poetic, beautiful thing. I mean, he's just, it's so beyond full of life that it's eros in words.
Right. And also the translator into English of those novels is also brilliant. I mean, in order to be able to translate the poetic aspect of it.
Right.
Because the poetry of that novel, you have to read that novel to appreciate how prose can be poetry, perfect poetry. And
even my dad, who was not only a poet but a translator, he would say that, because he taught himself Spanish years back to translate some Chilean poets, and reading Gabriel Garcia Marquez, he said it's one of the only completely beautiful examples of, if I read the original and I read in English, that it just sounds different because there's two different languages, but the story is almost the same in essence and in form. And that is a brilliant stroke on genius translator.
Now we have a question on the chat, which is an interesting question on this point, which is, question is, okay, what's the word for woman? And so you have to understand what the word for man is too in this context, because this is the origin of the word. Let's see. I have to find. See, it took me a minute to work this out earlier, but let me just quickly get it because I need to get the two characters up.
Yeah, together.
Yeah. All right. So there's the character I'm looking for. Let's see. What was I doing? It's just a minute. I have to work out how I'm going to get at these characters. Okay, so this is let's see. Let's see. Unpasteurized beer. Okay. No, that doesn't get it because it just translates it from Japanese to all right, let me say nama biru. Nama. Yeah. Okay. Where's this character? Oh, it's here somewhere. It's got to be here. Well, I get 7 different references. I didn't get the one I wanted. So Nama is not the character.
Is it this one?
Okay, let me see just a sec. That's the character for woman. I want to get the character for man next to it. Yeah.
Okay.
I already found that, but okay. All right, let me try from classical Chinese. Chinese. And there it is. Okay, yeah, there I've got it. Okay, so it's easiest to demonstrate this from the Chinese character, and even though it was a Japanese man that taught me this the first time, and it's a little gross, but let me do this because it's very clear. And I'm going to apologize. So this is going to be a little bit, raunchy, and I apologize for that for our YouTube audience. But the difference between man and woman, the simplest version, is what happened to it? Just a minute.
Yeah. So.
Just a second. This is Skip having YouTube show me. No, that's not the word. That's not the word which, because I was asked to show the woman, but you have to see the other version of man.
Right, which
in this version of man. Okay, so here's the version of woman. Here's woman, which I wanted to get. And this is man, but I want to explain where these two characters come from. It's a little raunchy, but this character is a man, and he's standing urinating. And the way this was demonstrated to me the first time by about an 80-year-old Japanese man was he actually assumed this position.
Okay.
and say, this is man, okay? And so by association, this figure represents a woman who is squatting for the same purpose. And so once you know that, and once you see that character, you cannot forget it.
Well, no, and what's interesting, if you'll keep that up, the symbol there for man in the Egyptian hieroglyph for fabric, Fabric, you have 4 pairs of barley stalks stacked next to each other on a common base. And each of those pairs, though, is the confluence of the male and female within each person. So it could be a couple, like 2 people coming together, or the confluence of the 2 sides of one person coming together. So it's interesting the crossover that in the Egyptian hieroglyph, I'd lean more towards person than man, but the same, and they have one for woman, man as well. But the similar concepts that are in play with the same graphic calligraphy is always kind of an interesting cross-cultural piece.
Right. And just to give you an appreciation here, when I looked up woman on Google Translate, because I had to get it up, I'll show you what I got. Yeah. Okay, so this is the Google Translate for what I found. And the simple character is here. And then here is the word woman, the word girl, and the word daughter. And you see, okay, this gives it to me in Japanese. So here, down here, we have 5 different ways of saying woman. And this is the Western, this is the katakana. Woman. Okay, so it's woman there.
Right.
And that's it. That's the phonetic way of saying it. But the more complicated characters are actually the Chinese characters that are used in Japanese, of which there are 1,850 approximately. So then girl has many others, and daughter has many others and meanings. And let's see. All right. So your point is that all Ezra Pound was doing was taking the Wade Giles dictionary and figuring out what the characters were and translating them into poetry.
Yeah, and I think he was actually spoon-fed from an actual trot that was doing the work for him, and then he would discuss and play the context and texture grain game in terms of language, and I don't think he had a lack of integrity, but I think that because he was famous enough that he wasn't called out for using a trot.
Yeah. So Jordan, let me just ask you one thing though. Are you on a Mac?
I'm on an iPad.
Is it possible for you to increase your output? I can't quite hear you very well. I can hear you, but I can't increase your sound.
Let me grab my headphones and that might help.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so I hope in one that I helped you there. And good morning, Kathy. Good morning, Wendigo. And right, and when obviously thinking in pictures is a great way to improve memory, and this is how great thinkers, let's say, just wait until Jordan gets on the sound with us. So
How's this?
that's better.
Okay.
All right. So Enlin is saying thinking in pictures could be a great way to improve memory. And I would say, yes, that's a great thing, because a genius like Einstein, he wasn't seeing all those numbers and then working out, something based on his, thinking through all these very long formula. He was seeing things. He was seeing it in his mind, so he could see it. And it's where most of us can't see. So, for example, in that Chinese character, for the longest time, because I was 15 when I was taught that character by the elderly Japanese man, I thought that was the Japanese word for man, and it is used in various forms referring to man, but it's actually the Chinese character for man, which I only know because I also studied Chinese. And it was not until later, when I learned about that statistical thing, that I learned that otoko is really the Japanese word for man. So I'll never forget that, obviously.
I love that YouTube comment about thinking in pictures increases memory, because from a memorization standpoint, to go beyond rote, there's the truncated version of the visual memory, which is peg systems, where you establish associative pegs, but they're still out of context. They're like little moons, something stuck to something, so that you think of this and it reminds you of that. But when you think about things in pictures, it actually puts them in context, and there's little baby stories. And that's a more robust, full memory that also is alive. When you remember it, it associates it sometimes with things in your life, sometimes other things you've read or experienced.
Yeah, this is why I very often have an image of a movie come up, right? Mm-hmm. Because I've seen so many movies, probably more than 3,000 movies. And when something happens in my life, I say, oh, that's this scene. And not only do I remember the scene, I first remember the scene, but I also then remember the dialogue. And so there's another point that I want to bring up here, which is it relates to neuro-linguistic programming, NLP. And that is that, the reference here is Wendigo says often remembers things better in pictures than by listening. And so in NLP, there's this distinction between three ways of interacting with the world. One way is visual, one way is auditory, and one way is kinetic or kinesthetic, and which is feeling. And so if you talk to someone, you can actually learn a how would I say this, a combination lock to get into somebody's head. Because if you know this secret, then you know whether you should say, I see it that way, or you can say, that's the way I heard it, or that's the way I feel about it, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you know somebody is a visual person, if you speak in visual terms, you're going to get through to them a lot more quickly than if you speak to them in sound or kinesthetic terms. And so it's actually visible when you're looking at somebody in a conversation, and you can actually see it in me. And so I'll show you my secret here, which is if somebody is thinking visually, they typically are looking up. So when they speak and they're saying something, they look up while they're talking. And the reason for that is the images are from the eyeball's point of view, they're up above you. For if they're an auditory, they typically look side to side. And because your ears are right here and right here, right? And so you're hearing it. And so a visual person will see things and remember them more easily because they saw it. An auditory person will remember more because they heard it. And a kinesthetic person will typically look down and to the right. And because I'm a kinesthetic person, you will often probably see me. I mean, and there's more than 1,200 videos on this YouTube channel. So there's plenty of samples to look at. If you look at my videos over time, you will see that very often when I'm not speaking, when I'm listening to someone else on a Zoom conference or something like that, I'm often looking down and to the right. And I'm reacting to it first, how I feel about it. But then I can also make the adjustments into sound and visualization too. So I'm also a very good visualizer. But part of that is because I've seen so many movies, I've seen so many things. And so when you talk about the bucket list or seeing the world, join the Navy and see the world, right? It's giving people this experience. They have to experience it in order to get in the game. And so we take young men that are 18 years old and we take them on an aircraft carrier to Hong Kong. Okay, well, that's a very emotional experience. So it gets through to the kinesthetics, but it also gets through to the visuals because they come into Hong Kong and they see things are very different from the United States. And I used to think of it in reverse, that someone who had grown up in India, if they come to the United States, it would be for them like going to Disneyland. It would be something beyond imagination to see the way we live in the U.S. and the way things are in the U.S. And for example, we had an elderly Japanese woman who's been a lifetime friend of ours for 40 years, more than 45 years, I guess. And she visited our home, not where I live now, unfortunately, but our home. And we had a very large master bathroom. And she walks into it and she says, "Oh, hiroi ne." And what that means is it's very wide. Because a Japanese bathroom is typically a very small cubicle. And then we'd be riding along in the car out in the countryside. And then she would say, America wa hiroi desu ne, which means it's very wide. It's very wide, it just goes on forever, right? And in Japan, things are pretty well smashed together. I mean, for most people, most people live in the Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, Kobe corridor, which is about, when I was there, was about 65 million people. I'm sure it's more like 100 million today. And most of the Japanese population lives there. And it's very unusual to find somebody who hasn't lived in that kind of claustrophobic environment. And there are some open spaces there. If you take the bullet train from Tokyo to Kobe, you'll find, there's some rice fields and things, but mostly people are living very constrained lives. And so the perspective of a Japanese toward the United States is, wow, this is a huge country. Yeah, wow, that's a huge bathroom we've got there. So So
actually, to further your NLP point, and one of my cues that earlier on, I don't so much do it anymore, but I trained myself out of looking up. I mean, the visual language is kind of my mother tongue, but I saw too many altered states, too many movies where the person who's schizophrenic, the psychotic, who's, basically incarcerated in Psychologyville. But they'd always, they're doing this, looking up, and this numinous experience is like talking to the divine. And I'm like, oh, don't do that. Don't go there. And I remember when I was younger, it's as if I did that, I would induce that. And I never really realized until I realized that was absurd that I was doing that. So that I noticed that my looking up was actually just barely looking up out to the horizon. So it was a long view up, but I wasn't, doing that. And when I discovered NLP, that's when I kind of went, stop worrying about what you're doing. Just watch what you're doing.
Right.
Understand it. And then that way it kind of, it unlocked the flow of language, because then I could shift gears back and forth like a manual transmission, and it became more natural.
Right. And it doesn't happen so much on YouTube where we're one above the other, but
right.
In NLP, I also learned about mirroring, which the objective is to sort of mirror everything that your counterpart is doing physically and visually. So if I hold my hand, or they hold their hand up, like Jordan is, then I hold my hand up the same way. And then I do it subtly. And at first, when I learned about this in 1990, at first I did it consciously, but after in about the last 30 years, I just do it automatically. And the reason I do it automatically, and I can consciously talk about it, is that it sets the other person at ease. They actually are seeing you, but from their deep unconscious point of view, it's they're seeing themselves in the mirror.
And it's a reverse visual psychological projection that receives what they're doing and accepts it. And I noticed that I do that with some people, and some people I intensely realize they do not need to be set at ease. And in fact, it will annoy them, and they'd rather the dignity of difference. And so it's interesting back and forth between people when we just kind of automatically and intuitively do those things, and also when we automatically don't.
And so, and one again is talking about cues. If you're extremely visual, then you have to have visual cues in order to connect with something, to understand something. And and so that's one of the reasons why video media has become so effective, because people can hear and they can see, but the problem is they still can't feel. They don't feel. And so, I mean,
the feeling's filled in, but it's averaged.
Right. So a visual or a auditory person may experience a feeling of crying, let's say. You see a sad movie or a sad scene in a movie, and it causes you to emote, to cry. And that's because you've taken it in through your visual method and then taken it down to your kinesthetic, how you feel about it. And then that's being fed back up. And so if you're extremely auditory, then get yourself a lot of great books on audible.com. and if you're extremely visual, then this is why YouTube is very popular.
When I laugh, one of my personal jokes is people say, "Oh, well, the book was so much better And I always quip back, the book is never better. I deal with imagination in my work. So that's work. So I'd rather be, silver spoon fed the movie. Give me the images. It may be a whole different story. It may be out of line with the integrity of the book, but I don't have to work. And,
Right.
So it's,
the point I wanted to make about the Love in the Time of Cholera is that the hero in the book keeps score about how many different women he makes love with. And the book more or less recounts every one of them. But in the movie, I think there's only one or two. There's one where he's writing the number on the belly of the woman he's just made love with, and with lipstick. And so that's a visual cue there, but it's nothing like the book.
Right.
Okay. Other interesting questions here. Wendigo, do you think being in the military trained you to be a kinesthetic learner, or was it that before? It was certainly that before Wendigo, and it is a kinesthetic learning experience in many ways. But in my case, for example, because my family uprooted me every 6 to 13 months, let's say, or even, well, let's put it this way, until the end of college, I attended 13 schools. I've now attended 16 schools, and through the end of college, I attended 13 schools. And so, and I can visualize every one of them. But when you're driving across the country and you're 6 years old or 5 years old, 4 years old, you're just taking in this immensity, but you don't have any context for it. And so, it wasn't until many, many years later that I understood that I had lived in such different environments. I mean, I was born in Biloxi, Mississippi, back in the worst of the Jim Crow days. And then I moved to California, to the Mojave Desert out of Virginia. And Virginia is very, very, lush in foliage and everything. And you go to the Mojave Desert, and man, there's nothing there. Especially,
well, you went from Japanese density almost to wide expanse.
Right. Exactly. And so, and then I went from that to Kodiak, and you may think of Kodiak as Alaska, so it's cold, but no, Kodiak is actually in the Bay of Alaska, and so it's always raining there pretty much. I mean, they get 140 inches of rain a year in Kodiak. And so my recollection of Kodiak is that it was always overcast, always gray, but there were these huge mountains, and again, they were very lush and so on. And then I went to the fruit belt of Michigan, and so I had to learn kinesthetically. How do I feel about this? Because my parents couldn't stimulate me all the time when we were traveling, so I learned sort of by rote how to react kinesthetically to all these new places. But oh, by the way, one of the things I learned in those travels, and I crossed the country 4 times by automobile, before interstate highways, before I was 7 years old. And what I knew in all those places was that I was safe, that my parents were there, and nothing had changed in the family, and it was okay. And I could have all those changes, and everything was okay.
Almost like a big turtle of a house, multiple people in one shell moving from one place to another, it sounds
Right.
like.
So now let's go back to the military issue again. The military experience is that you have to have the experience. And so, and that's essentially all kinesthetic. They can pour book learning into you. And, you know, that's one thing, but it doesn't teach you how you're going to behave in combat. And they can show you lots of war movies and, okay, you see that people are getting shot and that sort of thing. But you have no idea what it's like the first time somebody starts shooting at you. Mm-hmm. And so in training, one of the things that we do is on the rifle range, we pull butts. Now, the butts is the area behind all the targets where the targets get refreshed and so on. And so when you're on the rifle range for qualification, half of the class is behind the butts. They're protected by huge mounds of earth so that the bullets don't get through to where the half of the class is sitting, but they're sitting there and they're hearing. What they're hearing is what it sounds like to be downrange from a bullet. Okay, and a bullet sounds very different when it's aimed at you. You know, you know that bullet is coming your way.
And the worst one is the one you can tell, but you can't hear, because that's the one coming right at, right there.
That's right. You know, you don't hear the bullet that kills you.
Right.
Right. And so that's an experience being on the rifle range, and it's an experience beyond what most people think, because most people think what you're on the range to do is learn how to aim and so on. Mm-hmm. But the experience also gives you the experience in the butts where you are actually being shot at.
Yeah.
And the bullets are going right over your head. So you pull up the target, and then it's bang, bang, bang. And it's, 5-10 feet over your head. And then you pull that down and you put these little stickers or plugs in the target to show where the person's bullets went through. But, you sitting in the butts are actually experiencing what it's like to be in a battle.
Well, and two, the sound, if you're standing next to someone shooting, there's the kapow and the recoil noise, and then it's gone. But there's the way I visualize it when a bullet's coming at you is if you watch a plane break the speed of sound and they have that cloud, because that's coming at you. And that recoil noise almost puts you in the middle of this bullet drum, because you feel it all the way through you. And it's a whole different sensation than standing side by side. When a bullet is coming at you, it's like you said, it's completely different.
Yeah. And we're talking in part about the sound shift as things are coming toward you as a way to, it's the red shift where if you've ever heard a train go by you that's honking its horn, you hear
right
as it goes by you.
The Doppler,
right. That's the Doppler, and that applies to sound. It also applies to visual cues. So all those things in training, you want to experience all those things. So, you actually experience. And, one time I gave Oliver North a hell of an experience, because we were in a pretend war at the basic school, and his company was against my company. And so, I had an M60 machine gun that was with blanks, of course, but I had an M60 machine gun, and it was night, and Oliver North comes into this clearing right in front of my machine gun, and I opened up, and oh man, he was angry.
Well, shouldn't come into the clearing.
Yeah, it scared him to Kingdom Come. All
Teach him to come into the clearing.
So then, Patrick Hollywood, yes, young and dumb with the machine gun. Now, I probably shouldn't have done that. And what the Marine Corps didn't do well at that time was they didn't have people wear ear protection.
Earplugs, right.
And, the Army did. And so when I was in artillery school, we had earplugs, but the Marine Corps didn't. And so the result of that is I've had lifelong tinnitus. And so anyway, Blake asked if I ever skied in Japan. I certainly did quite a lot. It's outstanding skiing. They call it the Japanese Alps for good reason. Okay, Kathy, great point. I notice some people are desperate as they exhibit the inability to understand that they are being received. That's when mirroring comes in as a brilliant aid in closing the gaps. Yes, I agree. Mm-hmm. And so,
and if you can catch it too, if someone actually asks for attention, that's actually a form of aggression. And what's interesting is if you can catch that they need the attention and receive, it can ease out and balance out that piece so that they can stick to the intent of their messaging. So in one sense, there's an empathic piece to NLP that helps someone else stay true to the intense part of what they're trying to say. Yeah, kind of enhance the power of their voice.
Okay, and one other thing that Kathy says is that the feeling of safety is a blessing, and people often wonder about all of my travel, and I've traveled in some very hinky places, right? Vietnam for 9 months, and a few other places, and a long time ago when things weren't safe. But one thing that I've always done is follow the first rule of wing walking. The first rule of wing walking is you don't let go of your handhold until you've got your hand on the next handhold, because if you let go, you're going to go off the back, right? And so when I travel from place to place, wherever I am in the world, I make it a policy to travel when I'm sure I know where I'm going, the next stop. I may not know how to get there, but I know where I'm going.
Right.
And so even when I was 15 years old in Japan at 2:00 in the morning, in a country that had just been at war with my country in a terrible war for many years, what I did, my instinct at 2:00 in the morning was to jump in a taxi cab, because I knew that guy had he had a skin in the game, and so he wasn't going to do anything. Probably he wasn't going to do anything because his life depended on continuing as a taxi driver. So I was much safer in the taxi with somebody who knew where he was going, and I didn't know where I was going, rather than standing on a dark platform for 3 or 4 hours until the sun came up and trains started to run again. And so, all of us probably do this unconsciously, which this first rule of wing walking, but I do it very consciously. I never leave a place unless I know how I'm getting to the other place and that I feel it's safe. And
what's interesting about that is when I was in Paris one night, I had kind of a night off. I just decided to take the metro out as far as it would take me, just about, and still be, in Paris environs, and get off and walk back. Okay, sounds pretty easy. Never been in Paris before, but I figure I could, landscape lights or, kind of trailhead lights looking them back. But I didn't count on the safety net of the last metro I took was the last one that ran. And so I couldn't, use the safety net. And of course, I walked all the way back. I made my way back, but I was talking to my stepmother the next morning. She goes, "Do you realize that you walked through 2 red light districts?" I said, "They did feel more interesting than the other places."
Well, we're probably safer there.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, because there's skin in the game, so to speak. So, but I remember my mom hearing the story, and she goes, "Oh, there you go again. You working with that safety net firmly stapled to the floor."
Yeah. And so Kathy Kerr mentions here, know when to lean in and out of a situation and when to feel. Okay, because
nice. That goes really well with both the woman and man characters that Kathy Kerr, because they'll know when to lean in and lean out and then stay. That really gives that dynamic living quality to those calligraphy characters.
Yeah. So in general, I would suggest the rule, follow the first rule of wing walking in your life.
Yeah.
Don't get overextended. And,
right.
Well,
it's interesting because in a big way, this whole last year and then moving to New Mexico, there was that piece. But it's not that I didn't have a handhold. It's like, well, I don't know where I'm going to live. Well, I do have the cabin, but so I didn't even think about the cabin when I was doing it, but I don't think about the spare tire in the trunk of my car when I'm driving much either, so it was there.
Right. And so it's kind of the same feeling of safety, when you have to feel, as Kathy says, feeling safe is a blessed feeling. And so what happens in one's psyche when one doesn't feel safe, immediately your instinct of whatever your experience in life was or is activates, and something will come up in your mind that suggests a solution.
Right.
And for infants, let's say, infants don't feel safe from the first minute. That's why they're often crying when they're first born. And but obviously they feel safe when they're first suckled, and then they gradually gain experience. And so at one point they realize that if they emote when they need something, either to be fed or to be cleaned up, they know people will react. Okay.
Right.
They know that for the first 2 or 3 years, and that's how they get things done that they want to have done. But after 2-3 years, then they have enough smarts starting to open up in their psyche so that they start to see that you can't always do that.
Right.
And so when the child says no for the first time, then you know he's begun his individuation.
Right.
Jordan, I need for you to carry on for a couple of minutes here because
Okay.
I'm going to have to take a brief break. I'll be right back.
Well, Kathy Kerr's comment actually really is striking to me with knowing when to lean in, knowing when to lean back, knowing when to settle in. Because one thing about calligraphy characters, especially Asian calligraphy characters, there's such a personified picture language where you can often find people, animals, things that cue in the concepts of feeling and how motion is in play, in progress daily in real life. And just the simple comment, Kathy, of knowing when to lean in, knowing when to lean back, and then adding, when to settle in. That actually is, to me, a wonderful title, almost a book of how to read calligraphy characters without even knowing the language. They create stories. And I think that applies, obviously to the visual, but when you can play that kinesthetic piece and then hear the story, it's as if you can self-translate. And it's not such that I would rely on publishing the translation, but it's an interesting sandbox, I think, to play on that your comment brings up as to the nucleus or the essence even of how to better and more robustly experience calligraphic or calligraphy characters. And just that point that you made, that comment, just really, really struck home in a way of one of those dynamic expressions that really gets to the heart of the matter. In a sense, and then the feeling safe is a blessing of a feeling. That, to me, also doing things like that, knowing when to lean in, knowing when to back up, knowing when to settle, can help you impart this feeling of safety to yourself and your own environment, so that in a sense you're not inducing trouble by keeping yourself in the right place at the wrong time, or the wrong place at the right time. Either one can just lead to personal harm. But I think then that individuation piece of each of us owning how we place ourselves, and as you mentioned, knowing when to lean in, etc., and that connotes and I think promotes the feeling of safety that we can each give ourselves in our environments, and then also know how to communicate to others what's good for us. And instead of trying to navigate what I call the tar baby, it's like Brer Rabbit, the story of Brer Rabbit. You reach into the tar baby, and well, if you've ever had tar balls at the beach, they're hard to get off, and you kind of have to just wear them off. And that way we don't have to continually heal from our experiences. We can lean in, or lean back and connect with those experiences, I think, to make a more robust life as you move forward. It kind of reminds me of the broken face, Japanese kintsukuroi, where the gold fills the cracks, and then they're each better for being broken. Skip, I just kind of went through just a response to Kathy Kerr's comment of knowing when to lean in, knowing when to lean back, and adding in the when to settle as a way to experience calligraphy characters without a need for the actual words, because they often have a personified language of people or things or places that you can play in the sandbox to get a general concept. And that gives the words, once you find them, more of a context to play in the language.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking about my mother, who was definitely, she lived her life to the fullest. There's no doubt about that. And she was a force of nature. But I remember how adventurous she used to be, and how adventurous she would encourage us to be. So she would put me on a Greyhound bus alone when I was 11 years old to do a 400-mile trip to my grandparents. And I always would feel that I would be safe. But her story was that her father was a 50-year man on the Pennsylvania Railroad. And so he could get all these free tickets. And one of the things that he could get was tickets that would take her from Philadelphia to the U.S. Naval Academy, where my father was in college. And she talks about the queues that she would have, because many young women were attracted to the Naval Academy in those years. And at that time, there was still a train to Annapolis. There is no longer, but they would take the train to Annapolis, and the girls would have their hair in curlers on their head. And when they got to Glen Burnie, then they knew that they had to take their hair down and brush out their curls, get themselves ready for the men, right? But anyway, and of course I didn't know her in those days, but when it came to travel alone, my mother did this one adventuresome drive, which I still marvel at, and I don't know if any young woman would do this today. But my father had to go to Kodiak 4 months ahead of the family, because there was not a lot. It was during the Korean War, and there was not a lot of shipping or air travel to Kodiak. And so you had to get there, and he had a duty station that he had to be at a certain time. So my mother had been on the desert for 3 years, and she wanted to visit with her parents. And so we drove the car back to Philadelphia, but it was an old car, a 1936 Packard, actually, and which my mother called Kindness. And so we got back to Philadelphia, and my parents bought a new car, which was a Willis Jeep station wagon, because they wanted that time's equivalent of an SUV. So this is in 1952, and so the only SUVs around were Jeeps. And so they bought a Jeep station wagon. And then my father flew away for these 4 months. And there came a time when my mother had to get the family, the rest of us, to Kodiak. And so she literally had to drive across the country by herself with the oldest of me children, 3 children. The oldest was 5 and the youngest was 9 months old. She had to strike out across the country. And she did, except that 49 miles from her home, or 49 miles from the time they took the Willis Jeep out of the parking lot of the dealer, it just blew up. And so we started out on this trip across the country. We got, 49 miles from the dealership, but it was from her home. So I don't know how many miles she had at the beginning, but anyway, at 49 miles, the car blew up. And so here she is alone, 25 years old, and the car's blown up. And what to do? Well, her answer was, I'm going to call a fellow classmate from the Naval Academy that I know of my father's. And so she called him up, and he happened to be a Jeep dealer. And so he took the Jeep back and just gave us a new car. Basically, I mean, that's what happened over the next 2 weeks. But then she struck out again, and she didn't have enough money for the trip, so she had to have the confidence that she could drive to the Naval Training Center in Chicago and there get issued more money from my father's pay so that she could continue the trip. And so she did that. And, you know, meanwhile, my grandfather had said very seriously to my brother and me, and he was 3 years old, don't tell anybody where you're going on this trip. When you stop for gas and things like that, don't tell anybody where you're going. And of course, in neurolinguistic programming, saying don't to anybody is actually a command saying do.
Right.
And because
you make them not able to forget it. And so it's gonna bubble out typically,
right,
unless someone knows the discretion pieces.
So every time we drove across from Chicago to Seattle, through the Badlands and all that stuff, through Montana, Idaho, and Washington, and this is my 1952, mind you. So the cars, or the roads were not red hot, and every time we stopped for gas, my brother would shout, "We're going to Alaska!"
That's
sort of announcing, well, here's this 25-year-old, beautiful 25-year-old woman out here alone. She's got a temporary Pennsylvania tag on her car, and she's traveling across the country. You know, what could be a richer target? But of course, those were different times. And
your mom too. I mean, you want to talk about a constitution. I mean, you gave me, when you first told this story, one of the most priceless, indelible, awesome stories of the voice of robust human life. When, you know, cancer, oh, we haven't tried cancer yet, as if it was, you know,
right.
It's like something on the menu at a restaurant.
That's right.
And, you know, that was just her attitude. It feels like her attitude must have been like that her whole life. And
well, it certainly was. And the sweetest time of my time with her in recent years was the last 2 weeks of her life, when I basically camped out in her room for 3 weeks. And we shared a lot of stories, and she told me the 2 family secrets that she had never told me. And they were mind-boggling, because the first one was that she had voted for JFK in 1960. And I had always thought in 1960 that my parents were going to vote for Nixon. Of course, my dad was a Navy guy, so he was in that frame of mind at the time. And she voted, I remember her joking after the election that she canceled out my father's vote, but I didn't really believe it until then. And but that was her deathbed secret. And the other one was that my 2 grandmothers had 5 abortions between them, 5 in the 1920s when it was illegal. And so I think of these 2 women who were very straight-laced women. They were Victorian women. My maternal grandmother wore a bustle. I remember her wearing a bustle, and to think that she would have gone and had an abortion in the 1920s was a real eye opener for me, and you know, for what that's worth. But anyway, going across the country, I had this first experience of the archetype where, I don't know, we were in the middle of South Dakota or something, and I was holding I was holding diapers out the window to dry them. My mother was washing the diapers. There weren't disposables in those days, so she had to wash my sister's diapers all the way across the country, and they would be wet when we'd get in the car, and she'd have me hold them out the window like a little flag and dry them, right? And one time, I don't know, something got into me. I decided to let it go to see what happened, what would happen. And she looked down at me and I don't know, she gave me this numinous grin that in that moment, I knew I was in the car with a goddess, because she just laughed it off and kept going. I thought I was going to get in huge trouble, and she just laughed it off and kept going.
Well, in that moment, you didn't fall too far from her tree, because
not at all.
she might have been wondering, it took him a little longer than I thought to do that. It's like,
Yeah.
oh.
So
You know what struck me though about the 49 miles? It's a little baby Bardo, like a little living death of the Jeep wagon to get the new one and then get on the trip. So it was almost like she killed the car so she could get another one that would make it.
Yeah. Let's see. So Kathy says, I fight fair and am vested in I'm okay, you're okay. And ironically, that's the one trigger that came between me and Tim Holmes one time, because he had sent me the portrait that he had done of me. And this was the first night that I had the portrait in the house. And my first reaction to the portrait wasn't very positive, because one of the things I had asked him to do was to paint me in a happy kind of mood. And I look at this portrait and I don't seem happy. And I'm often, when I'm talking to someone, I'm often laughing and with smile on my face. And so I hadn't decided whether I liked it or thought it was a good likeness or not. But I walked past this portrait in the middle of the night without my glasses on. And oh my God, I suddenly saw an incredible likeness. I felt as though I was looking into a mirror, and I was seeing myself. And of course, I couldn't see myself very clearly without my specs. And but I just had this experience that the portrait had dimensionality, 3D, and that it was an incredible likeness. And so I wrote to Tim, and I said that I had seen these two things and I understood how he had done it. And he writes back to me and said, well, seeing your portrait in the dark and seeing the likeness is entirely unfair. I go, and that sort of set me off. I made a nasty comment to Tim, which I will always regret. But anyway, that's how he and I that's the sort of thing that has bonded us, because we can see one another's shadows and laugh it off.
Right.
When it comes up.
Well, and that's to the comment of I'm okay, you're okay thing. I could resonate with that. And to me, there's also the always complete, never finished, lifelong. None of us are broken. so that it's once you're okay, we get on with it and live okay instead of still saying I'm okay. I find that honestly, I'm okay sometimes is keeping the gears in neutral. And I know that's not the intent. The I'm okay, you're okay. There's a wonderful empathy that's conveyed there, so that it's not out to get people. It's very much dignity of difference. It seems like living with that.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, going back now to Pound. So I do agree with you that he was not a Chinese linguist.
Yeah, or nor scholar, right?
Yeah, nor scholar. And I don't know that he ever tried to say that, but nonetheless, he has written a lot of books. I mean, here's Ezra Pound on Confucius, and there's 3 books in here: The Unwobbling Pivot, The Great Digest, and The Analects of Confucius. And it's interesting that The Unwobbling Pivot, he had originally translated as The Axis, but he was prevailed upon by James Laughlin to change it to The Unwobbling Pivot, because the axis would not be a good word. And
right after World War II, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
That one question I just thought about it. I hadn't asked you yet. With when 76 One World and the Cantos arrived, this was with it.
I don't know anything about that.
It's a book called Commons, Myung Mi Kim. Seems, I believe it.
Jung?
No, Myung as in M-Y.
Oh, Myung Mi Kim.
Yeah, Mi Kim. And I have opened it and read it. I'm kind of interested in the serendipity. I don't know if it was a mistake, but it kind of works with. And it was in the same package.
I have no idea, because I did not put it in there.
Yeah, and it's interesting on the package slip. It was kind of interesting. The only thing on the package slip was 76 One World and the Cantos of Ezra Pound.
Yeah.
But both of these books were in there. So maybe someone tossed in a gift. Maybe they didn't want to put it back on the shelf, so they put it in my package.
Yeah.
So, all right.
You didn't see any reference in that book to 76?
Oh, no, it's...
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
in the book, I haven't. It's a collection of poetry, and I haven't gotten all the way through it. But I'm kind of wondering if it may have been kind of a barnacle on an order where this was somehow related, and Amazon just included it.
Yeah.
I'll check.
Yeah. So anyway, Jordan and I have this book, 76, One World and the Cantos of Ezra Pound by Forrest Read. And we've gotten that book and this book, Selected Letters. Right. And so the intention was and is to pick out some notable things in these books to talk about on these Sunday mornings. And there's quite a lot, in fact. And, here's just one where he's talking to James Laughlin, and he's talking about, I'm on page 4, and he's writing a letter to James Laughlin about what poetry should be. And he said, he says, here is a list of facts on which I and 9 million other poets have spieled endlessly. And so what he was saying is, I'm not going to be that kind of poet, basically. But here's what he says you should avoid, basically was saying you should avoid these things if you're going to write poetry. So one, spring is a pleasant season, the flowers, et cetera, sprout, bloom, et cetera. Two, young man's fancy, lightly, heavily, gaily, et cetera. Three, love, a delightsome, tickling, indefinable, et cetera. A, by day, et cetera. B, by night, et cetera. Four, trees, hills, et cetera, are by a provident nature strangely diverse, arranged diversely in diverse places. Four, winds, clouds, rains, et cetera, flop through and over them. Six, men love women, more poetic and singular, but the verb retains the same form. And then he goes on, in Greece and pagan countries, men loved men, but the fact is no longer mentioned in polite society except in the expurgated sense. I am not attracted by the pagan custom, but my own prejudices are not materia poetica. Besides, I didn't get particularly lascivious in ALS. What's ALS? Must be it's a reference to one of his books. However, in the above six groups, I think you find the bulk of the poetic matter of the ages. Wait, seven, men fight battles, et cetera. Eight, men go on voyages. Beyond this, men think and feel in certain things and see certain things, not with the bodily vision. And then he goes on at great length. But the point that Ezra Pound was making was and he always insisted upon during his lifetime, was the significance of culture. And this is one of the things that I want to start to emphasize and help people around the world as they watch these videos understand the importance of culture, because you can live your own life and you can feed yourself and raise a family and so on, but that's pretty mundane and banal, and it's not something that takes you out of yourself and creates a reason to live, a meaning of life, that sort of thing. And works of art do that, okay? And so, and also, going to religious services also do it, regardless of the religious faith. They take you out of your banal life and connect you to something that's deeper and more meaningful. And so do novels. That's why novels are so important. My mother-in-law is a retired librarian, and she's lived her whole life in her head by reading books. And now at age 91, she's very happy when every month I give her an audible.com book, because she can no longer read with her vision, but she can listen to a book. And basically, on the banal side, my mother-in-law is the archetypal woman, the archetypal mother who, found a man, married him, had two children and raised them. And then her husband dropped dead, and leaving her a widow for the last 30 years. And she never found her footing in doing something more than that, but she was a librarian, and so she was having very rich experiences by reading books. And others may do it by going to the theater, movies, plays, what have you, or they sit and just let the television feed it into them all the time. And they don't have any actual experiences in the physical world, but it's okay as a kind of life. It's a kind of life. But it's a life we would all fight for. Okay. In other words, it's we wouldn't want to just, come home from dinner, make dinner, feed the kids, and then what? What did our ancestors do for the rest of their time? Well, the women made quilts. I don't really know what the men did. I guess they made furniture, that sort of thing, in the night by candlelight or whatever it was. And so, this is the significance of culture. And, it's why Winston Churchill responded when asked why he had budgeted $55 million for the British Museum, or £1 £1,000,000, I'm sorry, pounds, not dollars. So it would have been about $250 million in 1943 dollars. And so they asked, why was he budgeting 55 million for the British Museum? And his response was, if we're not going to save the British Museum, what are we fighting for? And,
Right.
because you can live a banal life in the logos, but we don't really live there. Okay. And that's been my point for many years here, which is that you can produce something, you can produce children, let's say, but you get to be 45 or 50 years old, and what are you there for after that? The Aleuts had the answer when women got to be 30, they were seen as not useful to the tribe, and therefore they went up on the top of Old Woman Mountain in Kodiak and they jumped off, or they were thrown off or something, but they were killed at age 30 because they didn't see any use for these women after age 30. That's a shocking thing that I was introduced to when I was like 6 years old, and I actually climbed Old Woman Mountain in Kodiak, and it's quite frightening to think about. And it still is to me. It affects me today at age 75. So, for the last 70 years. So, Jordan, your turn to talk. My voice is dying.
No, I get it. Something I found of interest in selected letters is on page 31. It's letter number 37 to Amy Lowell. And it's of interest in terms of, this is a prime example of how, why Hemingway said if everyone pretty much was influenced by Pound. And this is kind of preamble to him as poet, editor, and employer, to Amy Lowell, London, 2 February. Dear Miss Lowell, Yeats sailed Saturday with your name and address carefully glued into his address book. I suppose The Egoist, the magazine, will run another 6 months. I don't think an American correspondent would save it. You can no more interest London in the state of the American mind than you could interest Boston in the culture of Dawson or Butte, Montana. Your note would be okay in Boston, but here I don't think it more than echoes the general opinion of every expatriate that any inhabitant has met. You refer to things like Schaeffler, which no one has heard of. It could well appear in Poetry, the magazine, where it would cause a little salutary irritation. Here it would merely be lost. I think The Egoist might well use something solider and more reaching. Yes, I thought Fletcher came up very well in Poetry, etc. Interruptions. May as well send this before it gets mislaid. So he's he's not really dressing her down. But if we go to letter 38, just the first part of it, dear Miss Lowell, it is too late to monkey with the anthology. Do you want to edit The Egoist? Present editrix writes this AM that she is willing to quit this in confidence. So it's interesting that just right there, he's not pulling punches, and it's very much it sounded to me like he was a wonderful boss, someone who would run, and I mean that would run a company, could hire and fire, and is willing to quit. So willing to quit means he probably asked her or told her, haven't you graduated from this company by now? I mean, so that they would leave on their own. But so in the one sense, he's telling her this is not going to fly. Would you like to edit my magazine? So he's dressing her down, offering her a job. So he's keeping everything in motion. And I think those two letters just struck me as a DNA strand of the character we're dealing with.
Well, we do see it, across the country in our politics. And the thing that drew me to Jungian psychology was that Jung was observing that people are in various states of development, psychological development all across the world. And so when we decide to do a confluence in Helena, Montana, where they have one of the most cultured sculptors in the world, in the history of the world, and yet, I just as an experiment, when I went to Helena on May the 6th, when I arrived at the airport, I asked the first woman that I met, have you heard of my friend Tim Holmes? And keep in mind, this is a city of 30,000 people only. And the answer is no. Okay. And it's like traveling to one of my boyhood homes, and I go into a 7-Eleven and I ask her, where's Plymouth Meeting? And she didn't know. And Plymouth Meeting was 2 miles from the place that she was working. Mm-hmm. And so we've all been exposed too little to too many things in life, and we need to get that bucket list going for one thing. But we need to also pay attention to the fact that in Helena, there is the Myrna Theater, which is one of the most successful small theaters in the country. There is the Cathedral of Helena, which has in it stained glass windows, incredible stained glass windows, which were actually produced in Germany before the war, before World War I, mind you. They were produced in Germany before World War I. They were kept in storage in Germany for the entire war period. And then these windows were shipped to Helena after World War I. And so culturally speaking, that cathedral just overwhelms the skyline of Helena, that and the State House, of course, because it's the capital of the state of Montana. But if Helena didn't have that cathedral, it would be sort of a one-horse town kind of thing, a very banal place to live, not very interesting. And so when Jung talks about some people still being barbarians and some people having advanced 10,000 years in their psyche, and you pass them both on the street, and you don't necessarily know where they are in their psychological development. It's an issue, and it's an issue that comes up, and it comes up in our politics in the United States, and we're seeing it very manifestly in
and that brings
January
up
6th things.
Mhm.
Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
That really circles back around to where we started with the characters, where just understanding that visual cues and context given in the Asian calligraphy characters give a place for the memory to live. So rather than just, superficial peg system associative clues, there actually is a residing location in the mind for that memory to thrive and to stay around. And then that brings back to the different scale of, Helena, Montana, and you have the cathedral and the state house. You go to a 7-Eleven and ask where Plymouth Meeting is. It's 2 miles away. That's the opposite effect, where someone is not aware of their place in a larger space, only within where they are right now. And it's not lost on me that the question of how does that affect our general wayfinding skills and abilities in life if we don't know where we are. So if we're so limited to what's in front of us and not seeing what's not there, but that what surely is.
Okay, so here's a good question on this point. N1 says, I wonder what is the best writing to bind most people. It's not intellectual yet.
Poetry.
Yeah.
Because you can discuss wars in poetry and it's not political. Even if it's political, you still get this lush context that I think softens the edges. Even if the poetry is vicious, it's still simply vicious. It's just, that's what it is, but it's not, you take it personally vicious. And there's a certain no man's land, the 300 feet space between two countries. Now you walk out there, you get machine gunned down, but it's that space between where anything goes. You're not beholden to either place when you're there.
Yeah. And so, it's a starting point because, for example, on the New Jersey Turnpike, there's a rest area called Joyce, is named after Joyce Kilmer, who wrote a famous poem called Trees or Tree. Let's see, I'm trying to find an actual copy of the poem online here.
Does it go with that Japanese character also?
Probably, although I doubt very much that it made it. But I doubt very much that it made it to that rest area. But let's see.
Also, to I think alternately respond to what kind of language is best as a universal language, or to bind all culture together. I think it would be story in general, not just poetry. Might be too fine a grain specific, but story, because
surely
story is just about experience, and we all have them.
Okay, so this would be on the banal end of the spectrum, but I'll just share this poem, which everybody loves, of course. Let me bring it up. I finally found it because people sell it in all kinds of versions, and you don't have to be an intellectual to like it. I think I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree whose hungry mouth is pressed against the earth's sweet flowing breast, a tree that looks at God the whole day and lifts her leafy arms to pray, a tree that may in summer wear a nest of robins in her hair, upon whose bosom snow has lain, who intimately lives with rain, poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree. Okay, so it's a very moving poem. And
Well, even the graphic, if you look at it, the asymmetry at the, I mean, the
right.
lower on the, I mean, that's it may be on the banal end of the spectrum, but I don't find it not meaningful. It's
surely,
it's
and so poetry is meaningful, and it does bind us, and that's why they named this rest area on the Jersey Turnpike after Joyce Kilmer, because that poem, and that's the one poem anybody thinks of when they think of Joyce Kilmer, is a binding agent for everybody that lives here in this country, and it's the essence of our culture. Go ahead. Sure.
I was going to say, and it's interesting too that that poem has all the general rhyme, internal rhyme, expected affectations that are superficial, that make for a horrible poem, except that the subject matter she draws in and the way she plays it, that just makes that the form of the poem and gives it a structure. But her messaging through the poem just, to me, sails it into the stratosphere. It's mundane brilliance that's actually genius.
Wow, it's mundane brilliance that actually brings in religion and
right.
all religions, not only Christianity, although she was probably thinking of Christianity when she wrote it. And
but even Shinto, from the hungry mouth of the roots of the tree suckling the breast of the earth. I mean, that's earth.
Right, and Kathy Kerr says it's authenticity in arting, dance, poetry, music. It's all art, expressing itself as life. There's magic in the mundane, and yes, and of course the art. The reason we call songwriters and singers artists is because that's what they are, and they bind us together. So I will always remember the first Beatles song I ever heard, and or the first time I ever heard the word Beatles, let's say, and and I was a Neanderthal at that time. I had been raised in the Navy. I was living in Japan. I was probably 16 or 17 years old. And I said, why are these guys going around with long haircuts? I mean, that was my Neanderthal reaction.
No, I get it. That's,
and why are all these women screaming? All these 15-year-old women screaming at the Ed Sullivan Theater, which I probably didn't see for another year or two after that. And why was my girlfriend at the time totally taken with these guys, right? And yet, for me now, looking back upon them, they're beloved. Partially they're beloved because they put Dr. Jung on the cover of the Yellow Submarine album. But
it's funny. I remember the first time I heard the Beatles was my best friend's room in high school, and I promptly got up angrily and left the room. What is this drivel? Because I was the heavy metal and Tchaikovsky. Mozart wasn't even fast enough for, so there was this whole cutesy thing until years later, after every time I didn't realize every time I was in that house, somewhere he had the Beatles playing where I could just barely make it out if I knew it was there. And after a couple of years, I guess, he had prison camped me into, I was accustomed to the Beatles. And so then I started to hear things like the heartbeats of the rhythm and how simple and living it was. But I had a similar averse what the heck is this nonsense at first, which I find.
Then I accepted the Beatles, but then I said, well, I can't I can't like these revolutionaries, the Stones,
Yeah.
The Rolling Stones.
Right.
I said, these guys are revolutionaries. What do I want with them? I'm raised in the military, and I believe in the Constitution and everything. What, these guys have even longer hair, and they're truly revolutionary compared to the sweet Beatles, right?
Right.
And then in 1964, which was my freshman year of college, my girlfriend took me to a Stones concert at the Washington Convention Center, and then I got it. Then.
Well, yeah, and what's interesting to me, the how long those two bands are still going. And I heard a joke several weeks ago. Well, at the end of the world, Keith Richards and Queen Elizabeth will finally go on their first date.
Right, something like that.
They'll be the last two people on the planet.
But that's the Ouroboros.
Ouroboros, right? Yeah,
it's the snake eating the tail of itself, and so that the two bands sort of speak volumes about the importance of culture and how it's a binding agent. Okay,
right.
And how country western music in the United States is a binding agent. Certainly among a lot of simpler people who they hear the country western singers singing the story of their life, and they can relate to that. They can connect to that, right? And even I developed a taste for it, even though I at first didn't like that either. I mean, I didn't like the Beatles, and I didn't like the Stones, and I didn't like country music. But then I did like.
I'm laughing.
I did like The Gambler and so on.
Yeah,
so
right. I laugh because in the 80s, when people started complaining that most heavy metal music had satanic backmasking that you could hear, in a subtle, subliminal way, that then country singers said, yeah, but the only thing you have is when you play country music backwards, you get your dog back and your truck back and your girl back.
Right. Okay. So we're about culture. We're talking about culture as we're talking about Ezra Pound, and we're going to continue to do that. My voice has given out. We've run our 2 hours. So, so Jordan, what I'd like to do over the next few weeks is, each of us pick maybe a letter from here, or a a concept that Forrest Read has brought up here, because what Forrest Read did, he was a professor at Duke. I believe he was at Duke. I hope he was at Duke. No, Chapel Hill. He was at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He was a professor of English, but what he did was he translated the Cantos for the average person, because like alchemy, which Dr. Jung translated for Marie-Louise von France, and then Marie-Louise von France translated Jung for the rest of us.
Right.
What Forrest Read did was talk about the point that Ezra Pound was making, and the point was about culture. And he did it in a very unique way. He had lived in an uncultured society at one point, because he had been born and grown up in Idaho in the 19th century. So it had to be pretty rudimentary in those days. And but somehow by the time he was 17 or 18, he managed to find his way to Hamilton College, which was one of the last bastions of the European university tradition of liberal arts. And and so in that process, he changed dramatically. And so at a very young age, by age 24, he was working as a critic for poetry magazines, which were only then, at the beginning of the 20th century, only becoming popular. With poetry was a way to communicate ideas that at the time were not communicated by radio, because there was no radio, or by television. It was only by literature and music, possibly. And we have to think, wow, that's only 100 years ago. And humanity 100 years ago, not only did we not have cell phones, holy smokes, telephones were barely existing.
Ezra Pound, that's to dovetail right into that. Ezra Pound as a businessman, because in that letter 38 later on, when he's asking if she'll be editrix, to take over the person who has still conveniently agreed to quit, probably by his hand, in a very tactful, deliberate, not going to get too much backlash way. He indicates that the magazine is done well enough that in the first 6 months, it has paid for itself in full for the next 3. We shall be able to do the same, and kind of thing. And what's interesting is that's him thinking about the magazine format succeeding, and then all of what he needed to pour in and his team to pour in for that to continue.
Right. Okay. So Blake Miller asks a decent question, which is, do you guys believe Pound really messed up by mentioning the social credit system and how it was used at the end of World War I? And, such things are part of our individuation. Okay. In terms of Jungian psychology, we all come from somewhere, and we all experience things. And, Ezra Pound got involved in some stuff where he screwed up, and Carl Jung got involved in things where he screwed up. So that's why I'm growing a mustache, because I'm going to play Carl Jung in this play next June 12th, 2022, at the Myrna Theater in Helena. And so this handsome mustache is especially for that. And so Jung was, a Germanic Swiss. The Switzerland is divided into French, Italian, and German-speaking parts, and Jung was from the German-speaking part. And so his basic cultural heritage was Christianity and German culture. And so after World War I, when Germany was flat on its back because of the Diktat of Versailles, the Versailles Treaty that got jammed down the Germans' throats, that was a mistake, because it made all the Germans at that time resentful, and so we got it fed back to us in World War II, and so that's why at the end of World War II we did the Marshall Plan, where instead of making the Germans resentful, we made them part of the civilized world. And the same was true with Japan, where I lived and actually lived that. And so if we had treated them the same way as Woodrow Wilson treated them, and the other leaders at the end of World War I, we would still have lots of trouble. And And so we have to get past resentment and forgive one another. Basically, that's what it amounts to. And it's the same issue that came up yesterday when Mark Charles was talking about his book, Unsettling Truths. Yes, all his unsettling truths are true, but we all have to grow up and forgive one another and move on. And as long as we're resentful, we're not going to get anywhere.
Well, and I think that's if I could segue from that, I think that's a great point too, because I'm glad Blake brought that up. But I don't find that bringing up the social credits from Pound's perspective or not as a mistake or not was the issue. The issue to me is that he took a position. And it's always important to take a position. Now, that doesn't mean you can't sit on the fence for a while you entertain your position. But to me, I think there's a piece in the modern world where people are too concerned with being in trouble, being ashamed, and making mistakes. And I think they're what I don't use the word mistakes anymore. I use OFLs. They're opportunities for learning. And
Right.
and it's like when someone says, there's any press is good press. Well, it's still, exposure. And someone's like, well, you made an enemy. Well, I must be doing something right. So it's the kind of thing where him taking a position was part of his experiential learning curve. And that was just simply part of his life. And so, as Skip was saying, it's the forgiveness, and you're not reviling people for what they have done. You can revile the concept that was the impetus that drove them to do that. But as long as they're not cruel, frankly, it's just life. And I think it's a matter for discussion.
Well, this comes up in our politics all the time. And
right.
So we had a exchange with in Colleen Kuber's group one time last fall, where several of the members of Colleen's group were trashing men, and especially red state men, for their patriarchy. And they were really getting into it quite dramatically. And it, basically gave me the sense that they were thinking we ought to just go out and castrate all the men type thing, right? And I said, and so that, specifically they were talking about red state men, and I said, no, wait a minute, I don't agree with that at all, because those men are the salt of the earth. They're my fellow Americans. They're the men who kept me alive in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And we do, it's just because somebody has what we would think of as an incorrect attitude about something, doesn't mean that we have to take them out and execute them. It means that we have to help them see the light, let's say. But we have to realize that we have a country here, and we live in a way that's a privileged way compared to the rest of the world. And the reason we live in that privileged way is we've had lots of disagreements over the 400 years of our existence. And so, we have to forgive. We have to learn how to reconcile ourselves.
I had a conversation just a week before last where the woman I was speaking with didn't like what I was saying, and it was about ownership, personal ownership, and I didn't direct it at her. It was just we were having a discussion, and then she just launches into a diatribe about how I'm mansplaining. And I'm like, just because I'm male, that's the new sexism too. The new feminism is becoming a toxic masculinity. Mm-hmm. And you get people like Colleen Kuber who are bringing in the divine feminine, that's not toxic anything. But at that point back then, there was that kind of motion, but I think there have to be those kind of intense motions to turn tides.
Right. So Kathy says cruelty, that's what I cannot stand by with, for no allowance for cruelty.
Right.
Well, I agree, and Jesus Christ agreed too. And, and, humanity does know better. We've tried various forms of organizational structure to help people interact with one another in a more open and reasonable way. Obviously, we have a lot of problems with spousal abuse and cruelty in the United States and anywhere in the world. We're seeing it in bas relief in Afghanistan right now. But we can't give up. And oh, by the way, in the end, somehow things have eventually changed. The problem is we cannot impose that change. And so I cannot impose a change on Mark Charles in terms of his perspective as a partially Navajo individual who has animus about the treatment of Native Americans. I can't impose my perspective about that, but at the same time, he can't impose his position on me. And so we did get into it a bit yesterday.
Well, and back to the I wish I wouldn't have been under the weather. Back to the cruelty comment. I don't know if Jung said it, whoever said it, I buy it, that all cruelty stems from weakness. And it does, because if you're unthreatened, you're strong enough to be gentle, and you're fierce enough to be compassionate simply because you're not threatened. And when you're not threatened, you can fully focus. But when someone's really threatened, they're overloaded, and they tend to then gnash it out at other people. And then that becomes a bad habit in a bigger way. But so I think back to just all cruelty stems from weakness. It really does, because it's not that there's no reason to be cruel. There's plenty of them, I'm sure, that could be legitimate, except if you're unthreatened, you're usually not cruel. You usually are connected to nature. You listen more deeply. You also probably can get, hot under the collar even more, because that can be just part of it. But I don't know. I just all cruelty seems to stem from weakness.
Right. Well, Kathy, I don't know what you mean, oh dear, toxic tags.
It's probably just that word, and I can apologize for using it. That word has been thrown around so much. It's just like when someone goes peace, it doesn't mean peace anymore. It's just like aloha or shalom. So that's a good call, Nancy, about toxic tags, because honestly too, these tags don't need adjectives. Truth doesn't need, solid truth, whole truth. Truth is truth, lies, love, and several other key things. We don't need adjectives for them. I think what happens is we get squirrely in conflict by using too many adjectives, which are basically cake icing kind of words if not used properly. They're just sugar.
I mean, the place that I feel it very viscerally is when somebody says to me, "Thank you for your service." For me, hearing those words from somebody after they've been used as a way to, slough off the fact that somebody didn't serve or that sort of thing, is like like fingernails on a chalkboard. And, honestly, yes, military people who served in Vietnam, some of them were treated poorly when they came back by people who are closer to Neanderthals than cultured people, right? and so, yes, there were some people who came back from the war and were spit upon in San Francisco airport. That happened. But at the same time, because that happened, I don't feel need for someone who doesn't know anything about my service, doesn't know anything about my reasons for serving in Vietnam, or even why the U.S. was serving in Vietnam, and so on. It's worse than meaningless to hear from somebody say, "Thank you for your service." I was
well, and it invokes another Civil War seed between two different. I don't even want to use the word factions. Just two different groups of people. Someone who's been in this, someone who has not been in this, and the person who has not been in this may understand it, but they may not comprehend it because the experiential piece, that component, is entirely missing. And why are all of these men from World War II so quiet? Why won't they talk about their feelings? Because they were terrifying, and because to bring them up would bleed them back out over here, and
Right.
they did not want to do. And they were basically protecting people. Now, at the same time, protecting someone from the truth is not always the best thing to do.
Right.
So,
yeah. So, just to be clear, I was thanked for my Vietnam service. I was thanked with 5 years of GI Bill. I went to law school and business school on my GI Bill. I was thanked with a whole door painted over the garage of my father-in-law's house, saying "Welcome home, Skip," when I got home. I was thanked left, right, and center, and I'm still being thanked because on October the 7th, I'm going to have my hip replaced, and that's being paid for by, in part at least, by all the taxpayers of the United States. Now, I can joke and I can say, well, when I joined the Marine Corps, they didn't tell me that I was donating my legs to the country. And, in the fullness of time,
right.
I can say, well, that's what I did in effect. I mean, that's what ground pounder means.
Right.
And as a result of being a ground pounder in my youth, I'm now going to have my third joint replacement. But, nonetheless, I am being thanked for that, but in the form of a new hip. And
well, and your thankfulness for that is a wonderful example of non-entitlement, where it's a salutation to the people now serving you for where you served, and that reciprocality is a more mature embodiment of how you are thankful and for what you have done. Not that anyone owes you joints. You donated these pieces, basically, as you said. And there's just a courteous and living appreciation you're expressing. And you're not sensationalizing it. You're not rah, 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 I deserve this. It's rah, 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 thank you. And can we each thank each other for what people are doing?
Absolutely. I mean, thank all the women for regenerating the population every 20 years.
Right.
There's something that we don't thank people enough for. So thank you, women. thank you for the children you've born, because otherwise we don't regenerate the population. And thank you to my daughters for giving me 10 grandchildren, thank you. But that's part of the human condition. And so anyway, obviously these things are very tied up and very complex psychologically, but I'm just trying to talk through a couple of them to give people food for thought. That's all. So
When
thank you.
I took note of our homework. Let's look at culture or something in 76 as a concept, and then either between 76 and or from the selected letters, how we can take that concept of culture and then tree down under it.
I think we have to. I think we really have to think about culture and how we value it and why it's important among civilized human beings.
And I agree. And I also think we've played the free form game with conversations with this. And I think that's always important as a form giver. So we kind of navigated and explored unknown territory. How are we working with it? And now we can dial into, all right, let's take this roadmap and let's take a path and
So
see where it
going
takes
back
us.
to Blake's point for a moment here. So yes, Ezra Pound made mistakes in his career and some of the things he said and did, and he paid for them by serving 12 years in a
Cage.
in an insane asylum.
Right.
And I've made certain mistakes and I've paid for them, and you can't make a mistake without paying for it. But at the same time, the way you're going to individuate and live your best life is by making mistakes.
Well, do you know the old joke? I've never been mistaken. Once I thought I was, but I was wrong.
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, so if there's anybody that would like to join our chats on Sunday morning, do write to us. We're having these conversations every week. Most weeks it's a conversation. Some weeks it's a soliloquy when Jordan loses his power. But in any case, I think it's useful. I'm honored that so many people seem to be following it actively on YouTube.
I want to thank everyone who's not just coming here, but engaged enough to make insightful comments, because that really, to me, from my perspective, contributes to my sense of feeling a value for what Skip and I are doing here, because then it's not just what Skip and I are doing. There's a greater community that's there. And I just wanted to extend my appreciation to everyone who comments, either way, one way or the other. The comments have always been thoughtful, and I appreciate that.
Right. And, Kathy Kerr had made a remark to Blake about how a chef that he used to work with, who had been a Marine Scout sniper, had reacted to my fingernails on the chalkboard type feeling by responding to thanks for your service. He would respond, I don't care. And Kathy said that's a conversation killer. And yes, it is a conversation killer, but at the same time, I don't think, Blake, that she meant that you were killing the conversation. I think that some people do react that way. And
also
Kathy points
sniper,
points that out by saying she wasn't referring to Blake. So I just want to
the sniper
reinforce. I want to reinforce what Blake said, which is that some people, those of us who have served, we wouldn't have served if we didn't feel thanked for our service in some way.
And I'd like to
there's a
point out
trade-off.
too. I'd like to point out too with that's a conversation killer, and that's a two-way street. And it is a conversation killer, but at some point, people who have served don't want to talk about it, and they're gonna sniper that conversation right between the eyes, and they're just going to take it out because they are not in a emotional place, physical place, mental place where it's not that they owe anyone that they can just be poked and prodded and take I need to make a withdrawal from your bank account, please. It's like they are themselves. So I think, yes, it's a conversation killer, but I think the reason for that can be a two-way street. So
yeah, and what I react to is one political genre in this country who now wants to glorify war. And I do not want to glorify war. I have never wanted to glorify war.
No.
I've been in the military one way or another since I was 0 years old for the last 75 years. And I don't think my father or I ever thought that we were doing it for the glory. And, some people who haven't served, you can win a Bronze Star for heroism, or you can win it for meritorious service. But, if I say to somebody that I'd won the Bronze Star, they always, their eyes light up and they say, "Oh, what did you get it for?" And the fact is, I got it for doing my job, very simply. And by the time I was finishing in Vietnam, within the military, the troops were calling it the officer's good conduct medal, right? So that's sort of belittling it, but it would be inflated for you to come home after being an officer overseas and having won a meritorious award of any kind and suggesting that you did anything but did your job right. And it's inflated to suggest that you are a hero. I'm not a hero. I never claimed to be a hero. I don't want to be a hero. I only did my duty and want to do my duty to my species. That's what I still am doing. But I think the idea of heroism got blown out of proportion during the liquid war years that we've been passing through and finally seem to be out of, at least temporarily. So I pray that we're smart enough not to do it again.
Well, my hope is that we can stop valorizing conflict and start valorizing interaction with dignity of difference, where it doesn't matter your side, I'm going to listen, but it doesn't get aggressive. People, if they get triggered, keep it to yourself. That's something for you to learn about inside, about yourself. That's a gift. That's a blessing if you own it. But the ability to listen to someone, and instead of always being consistently pissed off because they're on the other side, there is no other side. There's just that which gets our goat. And I just hope that we can valorize interaction with dignity of difference rather than continuing to valorize conflict, because conflict always ends the same. You're just poorer. You got to go make more money before you have another war.
Yeah.
Why don't we put the 55 million into art, so to speak, as Churchill did?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Jordan. Nice seeing you today.
You too.
I'm going to get out of the way so my mother-in-law can go to church on the computer. So peace.
Nice. Have a great week.